On a cold December morning in 2002, in a small Nevada town where everyone knew their neighbors and doors were rarely locked, a young woman named Rebecca Martinez walked out of her apartment to start her car before work. She never made it to the office that day. Her keys were found on the ground beside her vehicle. Her purse sat untouched on the passenger seat. Rebecca herself had vanished into the thin desert air, leaving behind nothing but questions that would haunt her family for nearly 2 decades. The case went cold almost as quickly as the winter wind that swept through the parking lot that morning. But 20 years later, advances in technology and one detective's refusal to let go would bring an answer that nobody in the community expected. The person responsible had been hiding in plain sight all along. How does someone disappear in broad daylight? And why did it take 20 years to find out what happened? The town of Fallon, Nevada sits roughly 60 miles east of Reno, surrounded by high desert and agricultural land that stretches toward distant mountains. In 2002, the population hovered around 8,000 people. It was the kind of place where Friday night meant high school football, where the local diner knew your order before you sat down, where families had lived for generations and newcomers were noted with polite curiosity. The Naval Air Station brought some transient population, but the core of Fallon remained stable, rooted, familiar. Main Street held a hardware store that had been there since the 1950s, a pharmacy with a soda fountain, a small movie theater that showed films 2 weeks after they premiered in Reno. The high desert climate meant cold winters and scorching summers, with wind that could strip paint and skis so clear at night you could see the arm of the galaxy stretching overhead. This was a place where people looked out for each other, or so everyone believed. Rebecca Martinez was 23 years old that December. She had grown up in Fallon, graduated from Churchill County High School in 1997, and worked as a receptionist at a local insurance office on Main Street. Those who knew her described a young woman with an infectious laugh, someone who remembered everyone's birthday and kept a small cactus garden on her apartment windowsill. She was petite, standing barely 5'2", with dark hair she usually wore pulled back in a ponytail, and a habit of wearing oversized sweaters in the winter months. She lived in a modest apartment complex on the east side of town, a 2-story building with 12 units painted a faded tan color that blended into the desert landscape. Her apartment was on the ground floor, number 7, with a small patio that looked out toward the parking lot and the highway beyond. Rebecca's routine was predictable. She woke each morning at 6:30, made coffee in the small pot on her kitchen counter, and left for work by 7:45 to arrive at the office by 8. She was never late. Her supervisor would later tell investigators that Rebecca had perfect attendance, that she took pride in being reliable. On weekends, she visited her parents who lived 15 minutes away on a small ranch property where they kept horses and a few head of cattle. She had a younger brother, Miguel, who was 19 and attending community college. Her parents, Rosa and Daniel Martinez, had emigrated from Mexico in the 1970s and built a life through hard work and careful saving. Rebecca was their pride, the first in the family to complete high school with plans to eventually attend college herself. December 10, 2002, began like any other Tuesday. The temperature that morning was 28 degrees, cold enough that frost-covered car windshields and breath hung visible in the air. The sky was clear, that pale winter blue that comes before sunrise. Rebecca's alarm went off at 6:30 as usual. Her neighbor in apartment 8, an elderly woman named Dorothy Chen, would later tell investigators that she heard Rebecca moving around through the thin walls, heard the shower running, heard the familiar sounds of morning routine. Dorothy knew these sounds well after living next door for 2 years. She heard Rebecca's door close at approximately 7:43. Dorothy noted the time because she was watching the morning news and a commercial break had just started. Rebecca walked across the parking lot toward her car, a 1998 Honda Civic, dark green, parked in her assigned spot number 7 directly in front of her apartment. She carried her purse over her right shoulder, keys in her left hand. She wore black slacks, a cream-colored sweater, and a dark coat. Her hair was pulled back. She walked the same path she walked every workday morning, roughly 30 feet from her door to her car. The parking lot was quiet. Most residents had already left for work. A few cars remained, including a white pickup truck parked 3 spaces down that belonged to the resident of apartment 4, a man named James Holloway who worked night shifts at the naval station. What happened in the next few minutes would become the central mystery that consumed investigators for 2 decades. At 8:15, when Rebecca had not arrived at work, her supervisor called her apartment. No answer. This was unusual enough to be concerning. The supervisor called again at 8:30. Still no answer. At 8:45, the supervisor called Rebecca's mother, Rosa, who immediately felt that something was wrong. Rosa called Rebecca's apartment repeatedly. She called her daughter's cell phone, which went straight to voicemail. By 9:30, Rosa and her husband Daniel were driving to Rebecca's apartment, the 20-minute drive feeling endless. They arrived at 9:52. Rebecca's car was still in the parking lot. Rosa approached the vehicle and saw her daughter's purse on the passenger seat. The doors were locked. Rosa ran to the apartment, knocked frantically, used her spare key to enter. The apartment was neat, empty, exactly as Rebecca would have left it. Coffee cup in the sink, rinsed clean. Bed made. Bathroom counter wiped down. Everything in its place. Everything except Rebecca. Daniel called the police at 10:07. Deputies from the Churchill County Sheriff's Office arrived within 12 minutes. They examined the scene methodically. The car was locked, showing no signs of forced entry or struggle. The purse contained Rebecca's wallet with $63 in cash, her driver's license, credit cards, insurance cards. Her cell phone was inside the purse. The keys were found on the ground beside the driver's side door, lying on the cold asphalt as if they had been dropped or knocked from her hand. There were no obvious signs of disturbance in the parking lot. No skid marks, no blood, no broken glass, no witnesses. Deputies began knocking on doors. Most apartments were empty, residents at work or school. Dorothy Chen in apartment 8 answered immediately and recounted hearing Rebecca leave that morning at the usual time. She had not heard anything unusual afterward. No shouts, no sounds of struggle, no car engines starting or doors slamming. Just the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday morning. The resident of apartment 4, James Holloway, answered his door appearing freshly awakened, explaining he had worked the overnight shift and had just gotten home around 7 that morning. He had not seen or heard anything unusual. His white pickup truck had been parked in the lot all morning. He seemed genuinely concerned when told about Rebecca's disappearance. By noon, the parking lot was filled with sheriff's vehicles. Yellow tape cordoned off the area around Rebecca's car. Investigators photographed everything, measured distances, collected the keys as evidence. They dusted the car for fingerprints and found only Rebecca's own. They searched the immediate area on foot, walking the perimeter of the apartment complex, checking dumpsters, examining the scrubland beyond the parking lot where desert stretched toward the highway. They found nothing. The Churchill County Sheriff's Office organized search teams by early afternoon. Volunteers began arriving, neighbors and community members who had heard the news through the small-town network that moved faster than any official announcement. By 2 o'clock, more than 50 people had gathered. They spread out in organized lines, walking through the desert surrounding the apartment complex, eyes scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance, any piece of evidence, any indication of where Rebecca might have gone. The temperature had risen to 41 degrees, but the wind cut through clothing, making the searchers pull their jackets tight as they walked slowly across the frozen ground. Local news crews from Reno arrived by mid-afternoon. The story led the evening broadcasts. A young woman vanished in broad daylight from her own apartment parking lot. Her car still there, purse untouched, keys on the ground. No witnesses, no clues, no explanation. The phones at the sheriff's office began ringing with tips and theories. Someone thought they saw a suspicious vehicle on the highway that morning. Someone else remembered a stranger asking directions downtown the week before. Investigators logged every call, followed every lead, no matter how tenuous. The search continued through the week. Dogs were brought in, trained animals that worked methodically through the desert, handlers following close behind. The dogs found nothing. Divers searched irrigation canals in the area even though December cold made it unlikely anyone would survive long in that water. They found nothing. The Naval Air Station granted access to search base property. Military personnel joined the effort, walking in careful formation across acres of land. They found nothing. It was as if Rebecca Martinez had simply ceased to exist the moment she walked from her apartment to her car. Investigators began building a timeline with obsessive precision. Rebecca had been seen by multiple people the evening before. She had stopped at the grocery store at 5:45 Monday evening, purchasing milk, bread, and frozen dinners. The cashier remembered her because Rebecca had complimented her necklace. Rebecca had returned to her apartment by 6:15. Her mother spoke with her by phone at 7:30 that evening, a normal conversation about plans for the upcoming weekend. Rebecca mentioned she was tired and would probably go to bed early. Her light was seen on in her apartment until approximately 9:45, when Dorothy next door noticed it go dark through the gap in her curtains. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just an ordinary Monday evening. Tuesday morning, Dorothy heard Rebecca's alarm at 6:30, heard the shower, heard movement, heard the door close at 7:43. Between 7:43 and 8:15, when Rebecca's supervisor called because she had not arrived at work, something had happened. 32 minutes, that was the window. In 32 minutes, Rebecca Martinez had vanished. Investigators interviewed everyone in the apartment complex multiple times. They interviewed coworkers, friends, family members. They examined Rebecca's phone records, her bank accounts, her credit card statements. Everything was normal. No unusual calls, no large withdrawals, no secret relationships or hidden debts. Rebecca's life was exactly what it appeared to be on the surface, quiet and ordinary and completely transparent. This made her disappearance even more baffling. Clear's throat. Those who knew Rebecca began to whisper questions among themselves. Could she have left voluntarily, run away to start over somewhere else? But her purse was in the car. Her phone, her money, her identification. No one leaves everything behind like that. Could it have been random, a terrible coincidence, a predator who happened to be in that parking lot at that exact moment? But Fallon was a small town where strangers were noticed. No one reported seeing anyone who did not belong. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the statistical probability. Most victims know their attacker. Most disappearances involve someone close to the missing person. They looked again at everyone in Rebecca's life. Her parents were devastated, beyond suspicion. Her brother was accounted for, at school that morning with witnesses. Her friends and coworkers had solid alibis. The investigation began circling back to the apartment complex itself, to the people who lived there, to those who would have had access and opportunity. James Holloway, the resident of apartment 4, came back into focus. He was 28 years old, worked as an aviation mechanic at the Naval Station, had lived in the complex for 8 months. He kept to himself mostly, though neighbors described him as friendly enough when encountered in passing. He was single, no girlfriend or regular visitors that anyone noticed. His work schedule was confirmed through base records. He had indeed worked the night shift on December 9th, clocking in at 11:45 that evening and clocking out at 7:05 the following morning. He would have arrived back at the apartment complex around 7:15, approximately 28 minutes before Rebecca left her apartment. When investigators interviewed Holloway a second time, they asked him to walk through his movements that morning in detail. He had arrived home around 7:15, he said, parked his truck in his usual spot, went directly to his apartment. He was tired from the shift and went straight to bed. He heard nothing unusual, saw nothing unusual, slept until deputies knocked on his door around 10:30. He seemed cooperative, allowed them to search his apartment without requiring a warrant. They found nothing suspicious. His apartment was neat, sparsely furnished, exactly what you would expect from a young military man living alone. But investigators noticed small things. Holloway's truck had been parked in the lot all morning. His apartment was only 30 feet from where Rebecca's keys had been found. If he had arrived home at 7:15, he would have been one of the few people in the complex at the time Rebecca disappeared. They noted that he seemed calm during interviews, perhaps too calm for someone whose neighbor had just vanished under mysterious circumstances. When asked if he knew Rebecca, he said they had exchanged greetings in passing a few times but had never really spoken. Deputies noted in their reports that his affect was flat, his responses measured, almost rehearsed. They requested permission to examine his truck more closely. Holloway agreed. The truck was a 1995 Ford F-150, white, well-maintained. Investigators processed it carefully, looking for any trace evidence, any sign that Rebecca had been inside that vehicle. They found nothing. No fingerprints that did not belong. No hair or fibers that seemed out of place. The odometer reading was noted, fuel level documented. Everything was photographed and cataloged. Investigators obtained Holloway's phone records. No calls to or from Rebecca's number, no suspicious activity. They obtained his bank records with his written permission, nothing unusual. Regular deposits from his military pay, normal expenses. They interviewed his coworkers at the base. Everyone said the same thing. James was quiet, competent at his job, kept to himself, but was not unfriendly. No one knew much about his personal life. He did not talk about family or relationships. He came to work, did his job well, went home. The investigation was stalling. Every lead evaporated under scrutiny. Every theory collapsed when examined closely. The media coverage intensified as days passed with no answers. Rebecca's face appeared on the news every evening, that same photograph from her high school graduation, her smile frozen in time. Her parents made tearful appeals for information. Rosa stood before cameras and begged whoever had taken her daughter to please let her come home. Daniel stood beside his wife, arm around her shoulders, face carved with grief. The sheriff's office held a press conference on December 18th, 8 days after Rebecca's disappearance. The lead investigator, Detective Mark Stevens, stood before a room full of reporters and admitted they had no solid leads. They were pursuing every possibility but had not identified any suspects. He asked anyone with information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, to please come forward. The tip line continued to ring, but nothing substantial emerged. By Christmas, the intensive search operations had wound down. Volunteers could not sustain the daily effort. Investigators had exhausted immediate leads. The case remained active, but the momentum had slowed. Rebecca's family held a vigil on Christmas Eve, gathering in the parking lot of the apartment complex with candles and prayers. More than 200 people attended. They sang hymns and spoke memories of Rebecca and left flowers by her car, which remained parked in spot number 7, a haunting reminder of the morning she disappeared. The investigation continued into the new year, but with less urgency, fewer resources. Detectives worked other cases while keeping Rebecca's file open. Tips still came in occasionally, but led nowhere. In February 2003, the sheriff's office officially classified Rebecca Martinez as a missing person, presumed endangered. Her face went up on missing person databases and websites. Her parents hired a private investigator who worked the case for 6 months before admitting he had found nothing new. The trail had gone cold. James Holloway continued living in apartment 4 for 3 more months before his lease ended. In March 2003, he transferred to a different naval station and moved away from Fallen. Investigators noted his departure but had no legal basis to prevent it. He had never been named a suspect. He had cooperated fully with the investigation. There was no evidence connecting him to Rebecca's disappearance. He simply moved away, and the case went colder still. The months became years. Rebecca's 24th birthday passed unmarked except by her family. Then her 25th, her 26th. Rosa and Daniel visited her apartment until the lease expired, keeping up the rent payments for months as if their daughter might suddenly return and need a place to live. Eventually, financial reality forced them to let it go. They packed Rebecca's belongings with trembling hands, boxing up a life interrupted. The apartment was cleaned and rented to someone new who knew nothing of what had happened there. For those who have ever waited for news that never comes, who have watched the calendar pages turn while someone you love remains missing, the passage of time becomes both torment and numbing routine. Rosa Martinez stopped sleeping through the night. She would wake at 3 in the morning and sit at the kitchen table, looking at photographs of Rebecca as a child, as a teenager, as a young woman. She kept her daughter's cell phone charged and in a drawer, checking it obsessively as if a message might suddenly appear. Daniel threw himself into ranch work, spending long hours mending fences and tending livestock, anything to exhaust himself enough to sleep. Miguel, Rebecca's younger brother, struggled to complete his education. He transferred schools, unable to walk past the places he had walked with his sister. He eventually moved to Las Vegas for a fresh start, but the weight followed him. In quiet moments, he wondered if he had missed some sign, some indication that his sister was in danger. He replayed their last conversation, the previous weekend when they had watched a movie at their parents' house. Rebecca had seemed happy, normal, completely herself. There had been nothing to suggest that, within days, she would disappear forever. The investigation officially went cold in 2004. The file remained open, as all unsolved cases do, but active work ceased. Detective Stevens retired in 2007, the Martinez case one of the failures that haunted his career. Before he left, he spent a week reviewing the file one final time, looking for anything missed. He came back to James Holloway repeatedly. There was something about the timing, the proximity, the calm demeanor, but there was no evidence, nothing concrete. Nothing that would convince a prosecutor to file charges. Stevens wrote a detailed summary of his suspicions and placed it in the file, hoping that somehow, someday, it might prove useful. The years accumulated. 2005 became 2010, became 2015. Fallen continued its ordinary existence. People moved in and moved out. Businesses opened and closed. The high school graduated new classes each spring. Life went on as it always does, even when one life has been interrupted. But some people remembered. Rosa and Daniel kept a website updated with Rebecca's information, refreshing it annually with pleas for tips. Local news stations ran anniversary stories every December. The community held vigils on significant dates. Rebecca Martinez had not been forgotten, even if the active search for her had long since ended. Clears throat. In 2018, the Churchill County Sheriff's Office received funding for a cold case unit. Detective Sarah Kowalski, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience, volunteered to lead it. She requested a list of every unsolved case in the county going back 30 years. The Martinez disappearance was near the top of that list. Kowalski pulled the file in January 2019 and spread 16 years of reports across her desk. She read everything, every interview transcript, every tip report, every piece of evidence documentation. She studied the crime scene photographs, though there had been no apparent crime scene, just an empty parking lot and abandoned keys. Kowalski read Detective Stevens' final summary with interest. His suspicions about James Holloway mirrored her own instincts as she reviewed the timeline. She began tracking Holloway's movements after he left Fallen. Military records showed his subsequent transfers, his eventual discharge from the Navy in 2009. After that, the trail became harder to follow. Kowalski submitted requests to multiple databases, searching for current addresses, employment records, any trace of where James Holloway had gone. She found him in Oregon. He had been living in Medford since 2010, working as a mechanic at a private auto shop. He had married in 2012, divorced in 2016. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants. Nothing to distinguish him from thousands of other former military men living quiet civilian lives. Kowalski noted his address and began considering her options. 16 years had passed. The physical evidence from 2002 was minimal. There were no witnesses. No body had ever been found. Building a case seemed impossible. But forensic technology had advanced significantly since 2002. DNA analysis was faster, more sensitive, more sophisticated. Digital forensics could extract information from devices that had been thought empty. Kowalski wondered if there was anything from the original investigation that could be re-examined with modern techniques. She pulled the evidence inventory and found it disappointingly sparse. Rebecca's keys, processed for fingerprints in 2002 and found to contain only her own. Photographs of the scene. Video from the apartment complex's single security camera, which had been positioned at the front entrance and had captured nothing useful. Kowalski requested the physical evidence be pulled from storage. The keys arrived in a sealed evidence bag, exactly as they had been preserved 17 years earlier. She examined them under better lighting than had been available in 2002, turning them over carefully. They were ordinary keys on a simple ring. Car key, apartment key, two others that had been identified as belonging to her parents' house and the insurance office where she worked. Nothing remarkable. But Kowalski noticed something that previous investigators had not documented. There was a small scratch on the car key, a fresh-looking mark that stood out against the worn brass. She photographed it carefully. Then she had a thought that seemed almost too simple. She requested the file on James Holloway's truck, the white Ford that had been examined in December 2002. The photographs were still clear despite the years. She zoomed in on images of the truck's exterior, looking at the paint condition, the details of wear and tear. And there, in a photograph of the truck bed, she saw something that made her pulse quicken. There was a scratch in the white paint near the tailgate, a distinctive mark that cut through to the metal beneath. The shape was irregular but specific. Kowalski compared it to the mark on Rebecca's key. The dimensions were similar. She contacted a forensic metallurgist who examined both the photographs and the actual key under microscopy. His conclusion was cautious but significant. The scratch on the key was consistent with the type of mark that would be made by contact with a painted metal surface, and the dimensions matched the scratch visible in the truck bed photograph. It was not proof. It was not even strong evidence by itself, but it was a connection, however tenuous, between Rebecca's keys and James Holloway's truck. Kowalski began building a case file focused entirely on Holloway. She requested his complete military records, looking for anything that might suggest violent tendencies or inappropriate behavior. His record was clean, no disciplinary actions, no complaints. She contacted his ex-wife through careful channels, not wanting to reveal the investigation prematurely. The ex-wife's name was Jennifer Holloway, now Jennifer Crawford after remarrying. She agreed to speak with Kowalski by phone. The conversation was cautious at first. Jennifer had not lived in Nevada and had never heard of Rebecca Martinez. But when Kowalski asked general questions about James's behavior during their marriage, Jennifer's tone changed. She described him as controlling, emotionally distant, and occasionally frightening in his intensity. He never hit her, she clarified, but there were moments when she felt genuinely afraid. She had filed for divorce when she discovered he had been following her, tracking her movements without her knowledge. He had installed monitoring software on her phone and computer. This information was concerning but not directly related to the Martinez case. Kowalski pressed carefully. Had James ever talked about his time in Nevada, about his time in the military? Jennifer said he rarely discussed the past. He lived entirely in the present, never sharing stories or memories. She had found this strange but had not questioned it deeply. When she asked about old friends or former coworkers, he always said he preferred not to stay in touch with people from his past. Kowalski thanked Jennifer for her time and ended the call, then sat back in her chair thinking. A man who refused to discuss his past. A man who monitored and controlled his wife. A man who had lived 30 feet from where a young woman disappeared and had left town shortly thereafter. None of this was evidence of a crime, but the pattern was troubling. In October 2021, Kowalski caught a break that seemed almost miraculous. The apartment complex in Fallon had been sold to new owners who were renovating the property. During demolition work, construction crews found a damaged cell phone behind drywall in one of the ground floor units. The phone was turned over to the sheriff's office as a matter of routine, in case it had been involved in criminal activity. When evidence technicians examined it, they found that despite years of exposure to temperature fluctuations and dust, the phone's SIM card was still intact. Forensic technicians extracted data from the card. The phone had belonged to Rebecca Martinez. It was the phone that had been found in her purse in December 2002. But somehow, at some point, a second identical phone or the SIM card from it had ended up behind the wall of apartment 4, James Holloway's apartment. The discovery changed everything. Kowalski immediately contacted the district attorney's office. If Holloway had possession of Rebecca's phone or parts of it, that placed him directly in contact with her property. The question was how to prove it definitively. The phone had been found years after Holloway moved away. Defense attorneys would argue it could have gotten there by any number of means during subsequent renovations or resident changes. But the forensic team made another discovery. Trapped in the phone's case were several microscopic fibers. Analysis showed these fibers matched the carpet that had been installed in the apartment complex in 1998 and had been replaced in 2003. The phone had been in contact with that specific carpet, meaning it had been behind that wall during the time frame when Holloway lived there. Further analysis of dust composition confirmed the phone had been in that location for approximately 15 to 20 years. Kowalski flew to Oregon in November 2021. She brought a team of investigators and coordinated with the Medford Police Department. They located James Holloway at his residence, a small house on the outskirts of town. He was now 47 years old, living alone, working the same mechanic job he had held for years. When investigators knocked on his door at 6:30 in the morning, he answered wearing a bathrobe, appearing confused by the presence of law enforcement. Kowalski identified herself and explained they needed to speak with him about an incident in Nevada from 2002. Holloway's expression did not change. He said, "I already talked to police about that years ago. I don't know anything." Kowalski asked if they could come inside. Holloway hesitated, then said, "I think I should call a lawyer." This was his right, and investigators could not prevent him from exercising it. But Kowalski noted his immediate defensive posture. An innocent person might be confused or concerned. Holloway seemed prepared, as if he had been expecting this conversation for 19 years. Investigators obtained search warrants for Holloway's home, his vehicle, his workplace, and his digital devices. The searches were conducted over 2 days in November 2021. They seized computers, external hard drives, thumb drives, and old laptops stored in his garage. Digital forensic experts began the painstaking process of examining thousands of files. What they found was damning. Buried in folders within folders on an external hard drive that had not been connected to any computer in years, investigators found photographs. They were dated December 2002 based on metadata. The images showed the interior of a vehicle that matched Holloway's white Ford truck. And in one image, partially visible in the background, was a woman's arm wearing a cream-colored sweater. The image was grainy, taken in low light, but forensic experts compared the sweater's knit pattern to the sweater Rebecca had been wearing the morning she disappeared, visible in security footage from her apartment building. The pattern matched. There was more. In a text file created in March 2003, shortly before Holloway moved away from Fallen, there was a single typed sentence that read, "Some things are better left buried in the desert where nobody walks." Investigators brought this evidence to the district attorney. Despite 19 years having passed, despite the lack of physical remains, prosecutors believed they could build a circumstantial case. The photograph alone was powerful evidence. Combined with the phone found in his apartment, the suspicious timing, the lack of any other explanation for Rebecca's disappearance, they had enough to proceed. On December 7, 2022, 20 years and 3 days after Rebecca Martinez vanished, James Holloway was arrested at his home in Medford, Oregon. He was charged with abduction with intent to defile, felony disposal of a body, and first-degree homicide. The arrest made national news. Headlines read, "Nevada cold case solved after 20 years," and "Man arrested in 2002 disappearance of fallen woman." The story spread across social media, shared thousands of times by people who remembered Rebecca's face from missing person posters, or who were simply shocked that justice could reach back 2 decades. In Fallen, the news was received with complicated emotions. Rosa and Daniel Martinez held a press conference where Rosa said through tears, "We never stopped believing that someone knew what happened to our daughter. We never stopped hoping that the truth would come forward. Today, we have some answers, but our Rebecca is still gone." The community was stunned. Many people remembered James Holloway, at least vaguely. He had been questioned at the time. He had seemed cooperative. He had lived among them without raising suspicion. The realization that Rebecca's probable killer had been so close, had perhaps passed people in the grocery store or stood in line at the post office, was deeply unsettling. Those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have wondered if the person sleeping beside you or living next door is exactly who they claim to be, can understand the collective unease that settled over the town. The case moved toward trial. Holloway pleaded not guilty and maintained his innocence. His defense attorneys argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial, that the photograph was ambiguous, that the phone could have ended up in the wall through any number of explanations that did not involve their client. They pointed out that no body had been recovered, that the cause of death was unknown, that the prosecution could not even prove definitively that Rebecca Martinez was deceased. though 20 years of absence made that virtually certain. The trial began in September 2023. Prosecutors methodically presented their case. They showed the timeline, placing Holloway in the apartment complex at the exact window when Rebecca disappeared. They presented the photograph found on his hard drive, having forensic experts testify about the sweater match. They showed the phone found in his former apartment with fibers proving it had been there since 2002 or 2003. They brought Jennifer Crawford, his ex-wife, to testify about his controlling behavior and his refusal to discuss the past. They presented testimony from a forensic psychologist who described patterns consistent with someone who had committed a violent act and had spent years managing the psychological weight of that secret. The defense countered that speculation was not evidence. They argued that the photograph was too grainy to make a definitive identification. They suggested the phone could have been dropped or misplaced during Rebecca's disappearance and somehow ended up behind the wall through construction work or any number of innocent explanations. They pointed out that the prosecution had not explained what Holloway's motive would have been. He barely knew Rebecca Martinez. Why would he harm her? Prosecutors addressed this in their closing arguments. They explained that motive was not required for conviction, only evidence of the crime itself. But they offered a theory based on the physical evidence and timeline. Holloway had arrived home from his night shift at approximately 7:15 that morning. He had been awake for many hours, perhaps tense from work stress. He saw Rebecca walking to her car, perhaps had watched her routine before on other mornings. Something inside him snapped, or perhaps he had been planning this. He approached her as she reached her car. There was a brief struggle. She dropped her keys. He forced her into his truck, perhaps telling her he had a weapon, perhaps using physical force. The entire encounter would have taken less than 2 minutes. He drove away before anyone noticed, headed into the desert where thousands of square miles offered concealment. What happened after could only be speculated. Rebecca Martinez was never seen alive again. Her remains have never been recovered despite extensive searches in the desert surrounding Fallon conducted after Holloway's arrest. The prosecution argued that Holloway disposed of her body in a location he had perhaps scouted in advance, somewhere remote and unlikely to be disturbed. He returned to his apartment, cleaned his truck, and waited. When police came to question him, he played the concerned neighbor. He cooperated just enough to avoid suspicion while revealing nothing. He kept Rebecca's phone, perhaps as a trophy or perhaps simply forgetting to fully dispose of evidence. When he decided to leave Fallon months later, he hid the phone in the wall, thinking it would never be found. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On October 12, 2023, they returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. James Holloway showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Rosa Martinez wept openly, held by her husband and son. The judge scheduled sentencing for December. In December 2023, 21 years after Rebecca Martinez disappeared, James Holloway was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The judge called the crime heinous and calculated.